might, and hast made known unto me what we desired of thee. For thou hast now made known unto us the king's matter. May the Lord add his blessing to the reading of this portion from his holy and inspired word. I chose this passage of scripture as I often reference it as we've been going through this study, the Daniel 2:21, where he removeth kings and setteth up kings. And I thought this morning I'd read it in context, that we would see that it's actually included in a prayer that Daniel had made. And I was just thinking, how if we prayed more like that for our leaders, I wonder if God would give us a better batch than the ones that we've had. But today we're going to be looking at the Emperor of Germany and see how wicked and conniving he truly was. And it's after the time of Luther's death and the changes that take place in the Protestant Reformation in Germany, and just how, because of the deception brought forth by the emperor, how he was able to undo some of the aspects of the Reformation. So that's what we're going to be looking at this morning. I'll ask Barry if he'd open our class with a word of prayer. Thank you. Now, one of the things I always kind of delight in is when I teach a Sunday school class, and then Pastor Ian, without any collusion on our part, might mention something that was related to the Sunday school lesson. Now today, since I'm filling in for him, I'm actually deciding on which messages we're going to choose for Sunday school and for this morning. But again, it just kind of surprised me, this collaboration between the two. Because one of the things that we're going to study here this morning, and this lying hypocrisy of the Emperor Charles, is something that we see with lying rulers today, how they just continue to use deceptive practices. So I think when we get to our message for church this morning, you might look back and think, oh, we have an example of that in King Charles of Germany. So last week we concluded our study on Martin Luther, who was truly a promoter of peace. He was one who always thought that it was better to be martyred for Christ rather than to take up arms and try to defend the Reformation by the sword. But now that he was gone, his followers soon forgot that wise counsel. And so they're quite willing actually to go along the same lines that Zwingli did in the Swiss Reformation, of forming an alliance to try to protect themselves and then move on from there. Now, the German reformers had already formed a League of Smalcald. It was their plan to try to protect themselves from the emperor. They figured that, to be safe, they better form an alliance, and they did that in 1532. That was when Martin Luther was still alive. He died in 1946. But he was opposed to that. And there were those that went ahead with it, and the alliance was formed. But after Luther dies, then the Protestant character changes even more so. It becomes more political than it did before, than just being a separated church. So the emperor himself, now he jealously viewed the Protestant alliance as an empire within an empire. He wanted to get rid of this. But he was in a position where he had signed a peace treaty with the Protestants when he was in a war with the Turks. He was afraid that because all his resources are involved in this battle down in Hungary, that he could get caught and having a civil war at home and so on. So he tried to keep making peace with the Protestants. So when they approached him at Ratisbon and they said, here, sign this treaty, without even looking at it, he signed it, made a peace treaty with them. But he was always of the mind that his heart wasn't in that he wanted to overrule it at some point. So that's the nature of things at this point. And there had been a renewed war with France that was pressing upon him. He still had the threat of the Turks in Hungary, so he just feigned that he needed support of his German countrymen to keep everything happy. So he tried to keep his feelings and intentions hidden, but at the same time he was having some meetings with the Pope, saying that he was actually in favor of getting rid of the Protestants out of the land. So he's very two-faced. He's making the deal with the Protestants, saying, yep, you guys can do what you want. And then at the same time, he's making a deal with the Pope, saying, yeah, I will support you in trying to wipe out these Protestants. And the Protestants were deceived into thinking that, the meetings that the Emperor and the Pope were having were all done in good faith, and that, there's going to be peace in the land. At the Diet of Spires in 1542, this was when Pope Paul III, by his legate, he promised to hold a council. And they decided to hold it in Trent, which was in Tyrol between Germany and Italy. Trent, you probably heard of the Council of Trent if you've studied any church history. And Trent is now Trento. It's in northern part of Italy. And they decided to hold this meeting there with the Emperor Charles. He was in favor of the meeting and its location, but the Protestants objected to it. They were okay with a council meeting in where they could agree on matters of, they thought it would be an open meeting where they could just discuss Bible topics and just come to an agreement then on what the scriptures actually say. They were naive in thinking that. So when the Pope influences this meeting here in Trent, they were in disagreement with it. They said, we don't want the Pope planning the meeting, we don't want the Pope presiding over the meeting, and we certainly don't want it being held down in Italy. We'll agree to something being held in Germany and us making our own decision. So that's how things were all set up. And despite their protests, the Pope published a bull declaring the council be held. He gives a date of November 1st, and he actually names the 3 cardinals who are going to appear as his representatives there, his legates. So by the time the council began, war was raging with Germany. The emperor is tied up in battle. There's unrest in the country. Roads are not safe to travel on, and so very few people can actually go down to this Council of Trent to participate in the meetings. So the Pope actually has to adjourn the meeting for a better time. And although the Protestants had been protesting against this meeting, normally that would just be scrubbed from the minutes. They wouldn't show that, that there had been any opposition at all. But the Duke of, the Emperor's brother, Ferdinand of Bavaria, he influenced the Pope and those to include the Protestants' protests into the minutes as a way to kind of keep them happy. He wanted to keep favor with them as well. So as a result then, the Protestants were able to show that they disagreed with this. The Reformation then got a little burst of energy, and for a time now, until this Council of Trent actually meets, then the principles and doctrine of the Reformation were allowed to spread further through the land. So it was a little reprieve that they had. But even by 1544, the emperor still felt that it was important to keep the peace with the Protestants. And what he began doing then was meeting with and flattering the Elector Frederick and the Landgrave Philip as to try to keep them in his favor. These foreign wars, if they were suddenly to get out of hand, he wanted to make sure that he could call on the Protestants for help. But the Pope, he's getting more and more frustrated with the emperor, making these, kind of concessions with the Protestants. And so he's putting the pressure on them, on the emperor, to try to, rid the empire of these religious enemies. So there's all of this going on, and the Pope wanted this heresy to be rooted out and destroyed. Now the Vatican, excuse me. The Vatican had often tried creating a rift between the emperor and the Protestants in order to have them do their dirty work for them. But one of the things that we can see here is God's providential hand in protecting and preserving them through the past 30 years. Because while Martin Luther was alive, the emperor was against him, the Catholic Church was certainly against him, but for 3 decades, the gospel was able to prosper. But now that he was dead and buried, was there anyone that was really praying for peace? Because the brethren that are left, they're inclined towards, growing their military strength, and because their numbers had grown, they think, well, we're just bigger than we were before. We're powerful enough to defend ourselves. And so with this going on, the papacy and the empire now in agreement on a council that they realize that they need to somehow ensnare the Protestants. And so they're holding this Council of Trent in order of a way to make it look like they're trying to bring peace to the church, that they're trying to, discuss doctrine. They're going to try to heal the church of its diseases, restore unity. But their real goal was to condemn the doctrines of Martin Luther, of Zwingli, of Calvin, who was rising up. We haven't studied Calvin yet, but he was prominent at this time as well. And anyone else that was opposing Rome. So they knew that they had to join forces in some way in order to solve this Protestant threat. Now, finally, after many years of stalling, the Council of Trent recommenced in December of 1545. And it would continue sitting all the way to 1563, so 18 years later. And I was thinking they must not have had Tiana to move for adjournment of the meeting. So anyway, 18 years long is the Council of Trent. And so the time had come for the Pope's, he's happy that they're meeting, but it's still taking too long. So in the Pope's opinion, the emperor should have just relaxed his reliance on the Protestants as allies and just declared war on them. And the emperor, he had been holding off because there was all these other events in history that were taking place. There was a battle with France. It was finally settled with what they called the Peace of Crépy, where the emperor, he gave up a claim that he had to the Duchy of Burgundy, and the King Francis of France, he gave up his claim to Naples and Flanders in the north. And so with that agreement, though, they also secretly promised to help the French, that is, secretly promised to help the emperor suppress the German Protestants and to restore Geneva, where Calvin had established his state. So the emperor had also ended his war with Solomon, and he gained some of the Catholic princes of Germany. So now he was feeling confident that, okay, maybe this is the time when I could actually attack the Protestants and win. Now the Pope, in turn, he agrees to pay the emperor 100,000 ducats, which is the Duke's coin. That's what a ducat is, D-U-C-A-T. So promises to pay him 100,000 ducats to double, and then double that to what he had already paid to defray the costs of the war. He was going to cover the expenses for footmen and horses for the next 6 months, and also give him half of the church revenues collected in Spain. So this just shows how sinister the Roman Catholic Church is that they would use their money that was given in offerings to further a war to kill Protestants in their own country. So they also, the Pope also declared then all of these censures and the military force that should be used against any princes who might oppose their agreement. And they also agreed that the council should begin at once with the plan that once a confession of faith was drawn up, that they would pronounce anathemas against anyone who should disagree. This is not good for my throat. I got a lot of preaching to do today and I'm already having trouble. Please pray for me. Now, the framework had been laid against the Protestants, but when the council began, it was their intent to first undermine the Protestants' foundational belief of sola scriptura. The way that they thought that they could kind of, disparage the Protestant idea was first to attack their Bible. And so that's what they did. They said the standard of appealing to Scripture for all matters of faith and doctrine that was practiced by the Protestants was being attacked, and that what they said is the apocryphal books and tradition that the Catholic Church had been following was all equal to Scripture. They also at that time, in that council, decided that the Latin Bible, the Latin Vulgate, would be what would be used in the churches. And so this is after there had already been great progress made in translations of the Bible into the language of the people. So it's like a going back now to keep the people, from understanding the truth of the Bible. And that was continued on for hundreds of years. The Church, Roman Catholic Church, continuing to preach in Latin, and nobody, apart from the priests, and maybe even not even them, knew what was going on in their services. So these early, this is, one of the decisions that was made at the Council of Trent. Now, after the Protestants realized that this council was really meeting in order to convict them of heresy and then bring them into conflict with the emperor, because he's the sword that the Catholic Church is going to use against them, then they started to object, and they considered their demands. They published a large manifesto airing all their grievances against the council, and then stating yet again that they believed the council's conclusions were non-binding on them because they were outside of their jurisdiction. This was decided in Trento, Italy, not in Germany. And now Charles, he starts having second thoughts, because as he sees the Protestants kind of getting angry, he thinks, maybe I'm not really prepared to fight against them. Even though these other battles had ended for him, he really hadn't built up his army strong enough then to go into an all-out war with the Protestants. So he had to buy more time. So what he does is he proposes a meeting with the most active Confederates of the Protestant Reformation, which are the Landgrave of Hesse, Philip the Landgrave of Hesse, and the other is Frederick, the Elector of Saxony. Now, I've been talking a lot about John the Elector of Saxony. Well, he has died and his son has now taken over. His name was John Frederick, and just for simplicity's sake, I'll call him Frederick as we go through here. So this is who the emperor is now trying to meet. He's trying to meet with the top guys there, and then talk peace and unity for all of Germany and deny any treaty with that he had made with the Pope for prepping for basically a civil war. And this reminded me of a passage over in Proverbs 23 in verse 1 to 3. And I'll let you find that in your Bibles, because it's the idea of, beware when someone who's all-powerful like the emperor is trying to, wine and dine you and make you feel good, as if you're on his side when he actually has evil plans for you. So in Proverbs 23 in verse 1, we read, "When thou sittest to eat with a ruler, consider diligently what is before thee, and put a knife to thy throat if thou be a man given to appetite. Be not desirous of his dainties, for they are deceitful meat." And so I think there's, God has always given us warnings about the types of possible dangers that we can fall into. And that's one of them. And these leaders of the Reformation, they did not have the type of discernment that Luther did. They had kind of gone away from prayer and depending on the Lord's strength. They're relying on their own armies, their own military prowess, and so on in order to gain the day. And we're going to see that it fails for them. Anyway, Charles was known for his ongoing hypocrisy, but he was able to convince this Landgrave, Philip the Landgrave, that all was well. So he, duped by the emperor, now Philip goes out and he convinces all of the others about the emperor's friendliness. And subsequently then they all let down their guard and they become vulnerable to the emperor's scheme. So Miller sees this event as being significant as the one when Zwingli's men were also smitten by spiritual blindness. Remember when Zwingli was about to go into battle. And then that messenger came across the battlefield and he was warning them, oh, they want to have peace, don't go in and fight them, we'll have peace. And it seemed like everybody else agreed, oh yeah, no, we can avoid this. And Zwingli knew this is the time, if we are going to win, this is when we have to go in and fight. And anyway, the agreement, majority ruled at that point. They didn't fight, and it cost them dearly. Well, same type of thing is happening here. It's when the leaders of God's church then started becoming political and trying to lead in that way, then ruin comes to them. Apparently everyone else could see this evil scheme of the emperor, except the Protestants themselves. They got a warning from Henry VIII over in England. He secretly informed the princess that Charles was up to no good. He was determined to wipe out their doctrines and was actually using this current time of peace as a way to build up his army. They also got warnings from sympathizers in Italy who, probably closer to the Pope and hearing about the meetings that had been taking place between the two, they also sent down warnings of impending doom. Charles had issued orders to build up military recruitments. And without any ongoing war, what could be the purpose then of his enlarging his troops unless he meant for some sinister reason? And they knew how much he hated this small-called league, this alliance with the Protestants. So he was ready to, or getting ready rather, to uproot their heresies that were plaguing his country. So word was clearly out. It seems like everybody else, all the neighbors know what's happening here except the ones that are involved. And Charles' allies, they weren't keeping secret. The Pope himself, because he had made this deal with the emperor, and he was very full of himself and proud of it, he openly declares that he had made this secret agreement with the emperor that they were going to destroy the Protestants. So now that word is out. He's also starting to issue indulgences to build up his papal army. Oh, if you come and fight with us against the Protestants in Germany, you'll have a free ticket through to paradise. You don't have to spend time in purgatory and all of those false teachings. Now the emperor, he's a little embarrassed that the Pope is doing this. The agreement which he had made in secret, now the Pope is declaring from the rooftop. And so he's a little bit upset that it's all being made public. And then the Pope, in turn, gets miffed at the emperor for being upset at him because he said, look, you should be fighting the wars for the Catholic Church, not trying to make deals with the Protestants. So there's unrest on both sides. Now, even though the cat was out of the bag, the emperor still pretended as if he had the Protestants' best interests at heart. And this was clear to everyone except for the two heads of the Reformation, the Landgrave and the Elector. And they still continue to be deceived by the emperor. When they meet with him, he's able to smooth talk them and have them just following right along with his plan. The wisest among them assumed that Charles was preparing to suppress the Reformation, but they couldn't see it. And so he is able to then use this time to keep building up his army. Now, these ones, Frederick, the Elector of Saxony, and Philip, they're the ones that he really has his sights upon, because if he can take them out, then he knows that the Protestant Reformation will fall. And as transparent as all of this was, the Protestants, at their meeting, they come away convinced that there's no immediate threat, their religion is safe, and this just gives the emperor more and more time to prepare. Now, the wisest of the Confederates, though, they realize that they should prepare for the future. And so they meet in a place called Ulm in southern Germany. And they make their plans, which was to repel force by force, make preparations for war. And so they thought to reach out to the Venetians and to the Swiss and the kings of France and England for support. And Miller decries how long these reformers had fallen in a mere 30 years. From trusting in God alone, now they're doing what other nations would do, reaching outside of their country, trying to get mercenaries to come in and help them fight their battles. So they made appeals to the likes of King Henry and even that horrible King Francis in France. And now these foreign courts, they refused to help. But the Confederates continued to build up their arms, and they were successful. What Miller described as an army that they built up was one of the largest, most well-equipped forces of the century. They had over 70,000 foot soldiers who agreed to fight with them. They had 120 cannons, 800 ammo wagons, 8,000 beasts of burden, and 6,000 pioneers that were all willing to fight for the Protestant cause. So they also had then the support, after they built up this army, of their elector of Saxony and the Landgrave of Hesse. So these guys are now back on side with the Protestants. They have an army built up, and they're ready to go into battle. But this was the time that they should have acted, because the emperor has not been able to build up his army. They have 70,000 soldiers that are primed and ready to go. And the big problem is that now they have two chiefs trying to run this band. The Landgrave and the Elector, they were very different men. They had very different ways of approaching things. And this is what leads to their ruin, because they have equal power, but one is very decisive and looking at military victory, and the other one is thinking, no, if we just wait a little longer, maybe that we can work some things out. And what it ends up doing is costing them the opportunity of the advantage that they had of having a bigger army than the enemy and being able to act swiftly and go in and take the emperor out. Now the Confederates, they responded to an act of Charles, who issued what would be akin to an unlawful executive order. Basically, he ordered the Reformation to end, that all the Protestants' goods should be confiscated, their subjects should be absolved of allegiance, and to declare their territories being open to invasion. And this came about, his declaration like this, and he was really bluffing because he didn't have the army to actually back this up. But what he was responding to was something that the Landgrave of Hesse the Elector of Saxony had decided to do, which was to, let's just send a letter off to the emperor and tell him what our demands are. We'll also write up a letter to all the inhabitants of Germany and tell them what's going on. So that right from that initial thing, basically they lost the advantage that they had. They've now tipped off the emperor that they're ready to battle, and then he just comes back pretending that he's ready to fight them and declares, no, we're going to seize your territories, we're going to claim your goods, and anybody who was under mandatory allegiance to Philip or Frederick, they're absolved of their allegiance. So, with all of this taking place, the Elector and the Landgrave, they are required to take some sort of action. And the decision that they should have made was to go directly after the emperor and take him, because he had built up a small force in Ratisbon, where they had met before, and he decided, just for his own safety, that he should flee. So the emperor takes off to Bavaria, and now the Protestants are faced with this decision. Do we attack the army that was left behind in Ratisbon, or do we go after the emperor? And they couldn't decide. And days go by, and they don't decide. And what this does, while they're deliberating, their own army sees the indecision among their leaders, and a lot of them go home. They're not going to risk their lives for an army for the captains who can't make decisions. They can't do that. So their army goes from 70,000 down to 47,000. It's a pretty significant loss. In the meantime, the imperial army is growing. They're now up to 36,000 men. So the Protestants, they had made no plans in all of this either to prevent any foreign armies from coming in. And the emperor was smart enough from all the battles that he had fought in the past is bring in the reinforcements, as many as you can from all over. So he brought in troops from Spain and from Italy and other troops. And Ratisbon in this time became so reinforced that there was no way that the Protestants would be able to take it. So the decision now is made, well, we can't beat them, so we'll go after the emperor. So that's what they do. They move their troops, they go after the emperor, and all the while they're complaining that this just isn't fair. The laws of the empire shouldn't allow them to call in foreigners to help fight a battle against your own citizenry. But I mean, that doesn't make any difference. You know, they're the ones that were basically building up an army themselves to fight against the emperor, and now he's defending himself in whatever means he can. Now, they also believed that the Pope had sent into Germany his evil henchmen to set fire to the towns and magazines and poison the wells. And it's true that had actually happened. They suspected that was happening. But if you remember when we were studying Zwingli in the Swiss Reformation, the papal army had done that same thing. When Zwingli and his men were tied up, in civil war in their country, the papal army is coming in and causing all kinds of misery, going from church to church. Any church where they had seen that the images had been torn down or the altars had been burned, then they start attacking the people of that village. So this was going on in Germany as well. Now, amazingly, the Protestants were able to make their way to Charles. He was protected by only a small army. He had a very weak entrenchment around them. But again, because of this lack of decisive leadership, they lost their advantage. Philip wanted to attack at once, but John, he was just looking, for a better opportunity, perhaps. And so this, in the meantime, allowed the emperor, who was more experienced and protected by his best soldiers, to defend himself. So while they deliberated, the imperial army reinforcements all come in. His army gets built up in just a couple of days right in front of the Protestants, and he's able to defend himself. And in fact, the emperor becomes so bold with all of this that then he, when they do finally engage in a battle, he stands at the front on his horse, riding up and down in front of the lines, not even afraid of being attacked or shot from the enemy. He's going to all the reinforcements that come from all these different countries, speaking to them in their own language, encouraging them all to keep fighting. And so he wins the day. By nightfall, the Protestants saw no chance of victory, and then they all retire to the camps. So another wasted effort. Now, seeing their chance to beat the emperor had been lost, the Protestants now turned their attention towards the powerful armies that were crossing the border, because there were more reinforcements that were coming. There were ones that were coming from Belgium, these Flemish tribes, a Germanic tribe, and they started moving in. So the emperor now, he acted more offensively. He can pursue after them. They're engaged in another battle, and he can go after them. And he presumed that the Protestants would soon run out of money. He knew about the discord in their ranks where they can't make military decisions. So he's just ready for them to break up. They're self-defeating. And so he's patient, and the conflict goes on from midsummer all the way through to the fall. And then it's finally decided in the end by the treachery of a relative of the Elector of Saxony. There was a young prince. His name was Maurice. And he professed to be a zealous Protestant. He convinced people that he had not joined the League of Smalcald because it was unscriptural. So he was professing to be, so holy that he was against the League for that reason, not because he actually secretly was in favor of the emperor. He made these vows among the Protestants that he would maintain a pure religion, that he was separated from politics, unlike everything that he saw around him. But he was really a two-faced liar. And what he was doing was he was playing both sides. He could see there was going to be a battle take place at some time, and he figured the emperor is going to win. So he secretly meets with the emperor at the time of that Diet of Ratisbon. He's there secretly meeting with the emperor, telling him that if he'll give him the spoils of the elector and his territories, that he'll do whatever he can for the emperor. So this is pretty shady because he's actually a relative of the Elector of Saxony. And what he did is the Elector of Saxony then, when he goes off to battle, he goes to the young prince and said, will you look after everything back home here? Basically putting the fox in control of the hen house. And it's to undermine him. He actually entrusted his dominions in his absence while he goes off to fight the emperor out on foreign battlefields and so on. So as soon as he took charge, the emperor sends Maurice a copy of a ban that was against the elector and saying, seize all the property now, making it look like it's official coming from, as if Maurice could do nothing but just obey the emperor, and tells him to take possession of all the land, instantly seize it, and then retain these forfeited estates of the electorship. So this was all, just a thinly veiled conspiracy that had taken place. And Maurice pretended to reluctantly take over. He marches into the area with the help of Ferdinand's army. So that's Charles's brother. He sends his army to come and help him as if, we're coming in, we're just doing what the emperor said, sorry, uncle or cousin, however they were related, there's nothing I can do about this. I just got to go with the flow. Now anyway, when Frederick hears of this rapid seizure of his land, he's indignant about it, to think that he had been duped like this. And he eventually decided to head home, even though he figured that the battle that he was leading is more important, but it was the cries of all his countrymen that he was hearing from. These ones who he had been, lovingly governing in his own territory, and now that Maurice was in there, tyranny is reigning, because Ferdinand's troops, who were all battle-hardened soldiers from having fought the Turks, they are now in this area, and they're just, wreaking havoc among the villages, and you can just imagine among the women and the people in the towns and so on. And so he feels like, I have to go back and straighten all of this out. So as Frederick starts withdrawing from the main battlefront, then there's the division at the front, and then that army just breaks up. The Protestant army, which had been fighting the imperial army, basically they're walking off the battlefield. So Charles had the upper hand. The Confederates are divided. They become easy prey for the emperor. And a confederacy which only weeks before had an army twice the size of the imperial army could have actually driven the evil emperor right out of the country. And they lost their opportunity. And it's because they were relying on their own wisdom, man's wisdom, rather than relying on God. And the big problem that we've been emphasizing in these studies here all along is that this was the mixture of church and state. And then these are the consequences of it. And it was devastating for them. Now Charles saw his opportunity and he seizes it. With his army in motion, he moves in, and the Confederates, who were now overwhelmed, they couldn't recover. So Charles declared victory, and almost all the Protestant princes, the elector and the landgrave accepted, submitted to him in the most humiliating manner. So when the emperor declares victory, all these princes of the various areas and electors who had all joined forces together to fight the emperor, now they're all just submitting. They're just, giving up the fight. Charles needed money, and he then levies heavy fines on them all, make it all the more humiliating. This battle which you brought against us, now you're going to pay for it. And so he lays all these heavy fines on them. He made sure to collect it all. So only the landgrave and the elector are remaining in arms. And Frederick was busy. He's now trying to seize back all his territory from Maurice. And he's actually being successful in that. He's taking back the territory, and and then finally Charles catches up to him. There was many little twists and turns in this, but France had started to rise up again, so that kind of caught the emperor by surprise. So he had to settle that dispute, and then when he comes back, he's a little bit late, but he does finally catch up to Frederick going through the area, and realizes that he needs to seize him. So in the spring of 1547, the emperor and the elector engage in battle in two different locations. And then finally, the elector is wounded, he's defeated, and he's taken prisoner. The imperial army lost only 50 men, but 1,200 of the Saxons were killed, and many more were taken prisoner. So then Charles rewards Maurice for his duplicity. He gives him all that land except a little area for the Frederick's family, but that's all, and all the rest of the territory he gives to Maurice. So very shady dealings, and not a good answer here in the end. So now only the Landgrave remains in arms, and he held off from surrendering till his son-in-law, another man named Maurice, and the Elector of Brandenburg assures him that the emperor would guarantee his liberty, which he shouldn't have believed. But they were convincing him. They even took vows. So these two of his friends, they take a vow saying, no, we know that the emperor will let you go free. So after a while, he's suspicious of the emperor, but when his two closest friends are telling him, everything's going to be okay, we pledge with our own lives that you will be free, then he finally agrees to go and meet the emperor in a camp and basically sign a peace treaty so that they can end this civil war. So he arrives, the Landgrave. He humbly bows in submission before the emperor, who's sitting on his throne as a conqueror. He has all his ensigns and all the various princes. So he's basically showing, he has conquered back the whole empire single-handedly, essentially. So he's sitting there, very pompously on his throne, and then the Landgrave comes in, very humble and willing to submit to whatever is done. And you'd think, as Miller said, that there might be some compassion in a sense like that. He's completely victorious over the whole nation once again, and the last one's coming in basically on his knees begging him. But the emperor is not the type of guy to just give in and show kindness. So Philip was required to surrender his person and territories to the emperor, to beg for pardon on his knees, to pay 150,000 crowns for the cost of the war, to demolish any fortifications that had been made in his dominions except for one, and then to give up the garrison on an oath of fidelity to the emperor. So all his, the kind of the royal army that would be there would then have to pledge its allegiance to the emperor. So the Landgrave, he fully submits to it all. He admits his guilt. He approaches the emperor with the intention of kissing his hand, just to, as the final display of humility. And the emperor just, turns away from him, showing no sign of acceptance or reconciliation. But Philip was allowed to leave. So he goes out. He's invited by the Duke of Alva to come have a meal with him. So he goes there with his friends, Maurice and Brandenburg, who had said, you're going to be set at liberty. So they go to the Duke's house. They have a nice meal together. He's treated with respect and courtesy. But when Philip got up to leave, the Duke made known his orders to detain him. Soldiers come in and arrest him. So what a trick to play on somebody. And so as he is about to go home, they come, they seize him, and Philip couldn't believe it. His heart sank. He began violently expressing his anger at the injustice and all this scheming of the emperor. You brought me here promising me peace, and his friends that were there, they're saying, yeah, he's supposed to be setting you at liberty. So whether they were part of it or not is hard to say, but they still pleaded that he was supposed to be left, but the Duke wouldn't let him go. A Spanish guard takes him as prisoner, and he's kept as a prisoner for 5 years. So pretty rotten. Now the worst even is yet to come, because as the emperor then goes out on a parade, basically, to show that he is victorious over Germany once again, he actually has Philip the Landgrave and Frederick following in the train behind him for everybody to laugh at and ridicule. So he's bringing these two men of the Reformation behind the train, and then as they go from town to town, just putting them in prison and putting them on as a spectacle before all the people. So very humiliating. Now, many protested this. They thought this is going way too far. When these men basically gave up and submitted to you instead of, killing you or continually fighting right to the end, they were pretty upset with it. And what it ultimately does lead to is this kind of festering anger against the emperor, which is to come against him at a later point, I guess. But Frederick, who was a true Christian, he accepted all this affliction from the Lord's hand. He dropped the spirit of being a warrior and he embraced that of being a martyr. And historians praise him for his humble meekness and patience and Christian conduct. So as he was going behind the train, he just accepted, look, this is, from the Lord, and this is how it's going to be. Whereas the other man, he was so angry, and what he did is he showed his true colors by actually renouncing his faith in a bargain for freedom. And so, you can kind of see where, trials will actually bring out what a person really believes in their heart. And some of these reformers on the political sense, they could have been just professing in name only type of thing. Well, here's a cause, they want to be on the winning team type of thing, or they like being the underdog and try to be victorious and so on. But their true colors come out. I remember Pastor Ian speaking of a lady over in Cape Breton who often said this phrase, "The Lord will test your profession." And I think that's true. We will probably find ourselves in times of great trial, tribulation, and testing, and what we truly believe will come out at that time. So it's very important that in the good times especially, that we're building up strong Christian character and we know the truth and we're willing to stand on it when the tough times come. Now, the Emperor Charles, he wasn't done yet even. He made all the other princes of the Reformation feel his power. He seized their artillery, their magazines, any members of that small called league. He seized their weaponry, so he had about 500 of their cannons. And then he didn't need them himself. What he actually did was distribute them among other countries, even gifting them to Italy and Spain, kind of as a further way of just showing how powerful he was. He could give away cannons. He could give away necessary military might. Now, he also levied heavy fines on all of these for paying off the war expenses. And he was able to bring into his treasury over 1.6 million crowns, which was a huge sum in the 16th century. Now, the German people, they despised all of this. And so, as I mentioned, this will at some point come back against Charles. But Charles was certainly acting very evil towards the German people. And his brother Ferdinand was doing the same thing. He was also in the area of Bohemia and, carrying out acts of tyranny over there. And sadly, this is a repeated story throughout history. And it happens over and over again. And so when we get to our message this morning, we can always almost see harbingers of this about to take place in our day. So that's where we're going to end our lesson here this morning. And we have a break now before the morning